Good morning, everyone. I'm Carmelo Barbaro, Executive Director of the Inclusive Economy Lab at the University of Chicago. Today, I'm honored to share findings from our recently released report, Known, Valued, Inspired, New Evidence on Student Homelessness. This report is a result of a multi-year partnership with the Chicago Public Schools. We work closely with the Office of Student Support and Engagement at district headquarters and spoke extensively with principals, school liaisons, parents, and students to better understand the hopes and dreams, as well as the struggles of young people experiencing homelessness. Our work included quantitative analyses of more than a decade of student records, as well as qualitative research. Our partnership with the Chicago Public Schools on this topic is unique in the country, and we are extremely grateful to current and former CPS staff, especially Molly Burke, Chevelle Bailey, and Claire Bowman for their dedication to advancing policies and practices that can help these promising young people achieve their full potential. This work also would not have been possible without the dedication of Inclusive Economy Lab staff, especially Annie Driscoll, and the support of our funders, especially the Crown Family Philanthropies, the Polk Brothers Foundation, the University of Chicago Women's Board, Scott Adelson, and Renee Adelson-Cass. Prior to the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic, the Department of Education estimated that approximately 1 million students experienced homelessness each year in the United States. The Department of Education defines homelessness expansively. It includes students living on the street, in a car, or in an emergency shelter. The Department of Education also considers students living doubled up, that is, students who are living as a guest in someone else's home, as experiencing homelessness. As such, we will use the terms homeless and housing unstable interchangeably in this presentation. As this presentation will make clear, student homelessness is an equity issue for Chicago. Chicago's children are not at equal risk of experiencing homelessness. It is a struggle experienced disproportionately by the city's Black community. As a result of systematic, long-standing exclusion from economic opportunity and wealth-building opportunities, Black children are much more likely to experience poverty in Chicago. Black parents are also much more likely to experience eviction, which can make it more challenging to secure stable housing in the future. Historic over-policing of Black communities further exacerbates the challenges that Black residents face in securing and maintaining safe, stable, and affordable housing. Educators in Chicago and community organizations are doing a great deal to support students as best they can. And through today's discussion, we will lift up promising practices and talk about strategies for the future. Our hope is that this work will help policymakers, elected officials, and funders to better understand and experience that students and families so often do their best to hide, and to do more to address the underlying inequities in access to safe, stable, and affordable housing. We will begin today's event with a presentation of high-level findings from Dr. Shantá Robinson and Dr. Kelly Hallberg. Dr. Robinson is a professor at the Crown School of Social Work, Policy, and Practice at the University of Chicago, and Dr. Hallberg is the scientific director of the Inclusive Economy Lab. We will then take a moment to answer audience questions about the research. We will turn to Michael Deuser, Chief of the Office of College and Career Success at the Chicago Public Schools, and hear from him about how this research is informing district efforts to support students experiencing homelessness. Finally, my colleague Emily Metz will facilitate a panel discussion focused on promising practices and potential solutions for the future. With that, I am pleased to introduce Dr. Shantá Robinson.
Thank you, Carmelo, and good morning and welcome to you all. We start with stories. We start by acknowledging that our social world, including that of schools, education-based spaces, is not one that is fixed. As Gloria Ladson-Billings tells us, we construct our worlds with our experiences, our words, as well as our silences. As such, it was important for us to speak directly with families, caregivers, students, and school personnel to come to understanding, to get a clearer picture of housing instability and how it plays a role in the schooling experiences of students and families. So whose stories? We conducted focus groups and spoke with students and families who represented over 15 CPS neighborhood schools, 6 additional Chicago charter or option schools, for a total of 21. These schools were located from the far south, throughout the west, and to the far north. Our sample was diverse in nearly all demographics, including race, ethnicity, age, and gender. So what did we learn? While all the findings can be read in our report, we will discuss some of these findings today. Our first quote comes from Carrie. Carrie notes here that opening a book never paid her bills. It is critical to understand what Carrie is saying here. She's not saying that school is unimportant or that education isn't essential. In fact, she herself is pursuing higher education. Her housing instability led her to prioritize her needs in such a way that paying her bills rose to the top. And in her community, her family, and the spaces she inhabited, she didn't see a connection between education and economic stability or economic mobility. Our next quote here is from Waleed. Waleed adds another component here that was echoed with every single participant in the study. They are all trying. They are working through difficult home lives and living situations, and what rises to the top again and again is the pursuit of higher education. Finally, our quote here from Kevin gives some insight into what he thinks would help other students like him succeed. More understanding, more empathy. Now, it may be easy to be cynical about the experiences of young people, and their plea for more empathy can be interpreted by some as their desire for lower expectations or maybe a free pass. But the young people in the study weren't asking for lower expectations. They were asking for resources, mentorship and guidance, and a response to their housing instability that was foregrounded by a focus on empathy. The report provides details regarding all of the common themes from the focus groups. And in this next slide, you can see in the graphic that these themes overlap with one another in multiple complex ways. Many instances of trauma coincide with familial strife. Similarly, barriers to economic opportunity are often intricately related to experiences of housing instability. I'd like to go through each of these briefly, starting with trauma. Of the focus group participants, 28% reported experiencing sexual or physical violence as children. I share here the story of Angelina, a young Black woman who has young children whom she describes as the most important part of her life. They were experiencing homelessness together at the time of our study. During her academic tenure, she engaged with the foster care system and left high school before graduating. In her recounting, she states that she regrets not finishing high school, but also brings up that housing instability is not the sole source of difficulty in her life, but instead it is an ongoing issue that makes the challenges of her life and her desire to be a good parent that much harder. Moving over to housing instability, we discuss Lilith's story. Lilith remembers living in shelters with her father throughout her childhood. The cycle of instability continued for her through adolescence as she experienced homelessness and foster care involvement. And like Angelina, she is now raising young children and couch surfing with her children. Her estrangement from her father, his eventual death, and the fire at her sister's house particularly highlight a dwindling pool of social capital on which she can rely for support. The constancy of crisis in Lilith's life, like Angelina's, drowns out details about school and housing instability. Instead, her experience of loss, both of their experiences of loss, are at the forefront of their stories and are deeply intertwined with their long history of homelessness and housing instability. Next, we have economic barriers and Waleed's story. 10% of focus group participants over the age of 18 reported that they were currently employed. Only one of the 42 participants was employed full-time. Waleed was one of the part-time employed. He is ambitious and resourceful, having worked in some capacity since he was a child. When we spoke with Waleed, he was looking for a full-time job and staying in an emergency overnight shelter. Although he had more than a dozen workforce certifications, not having a permanent address impeded his journey for full-time living wage work. And finally, we have family life and Kevin's story. Smart and capable, Kevin expressed frustration that his personal circumstances created such obstacles to his academic engagement, and he draws a clear correlation between his personal life and his difficulty succeeding in school. He quotes, "I was always a 3.8 or better GPA, always on high honor roll. So like academics for me was never an issue. It was just my behavior was always an issue, which can in turn affect your grades when you miss days, tardies, stuff that matters. I was just a young, angry kid with no father. Mother got to support 3 kids in a shelter by herself while working dead end at the CNA job being a nurse. So it was just anger," end quote. It is no surprise that all of this data led us to put schools and the schooling experience at the center of this ecological model. Schools are powerful, influential institutions and can, with the right leadership and resources, improve the academic outcomes and as such, the life chances of young people and families dealing with homelessness and housing instability. And the stories, the voices of these young people and their parents and caregivers echoed that sentiment time and time again. At this time, I'm going to pass it over to Kelly to discuss the quantitative findings, which are informed our qualitative component.
Great. Thanks, Shantá. As Carmelo mentioned at the onset, the Inclusive Economy Lab's deep partnership with Chicago Public Schools has allowed us to access over 10 years of student records to examine the scope and scale of housing instability in the district, as well as to understand how the experience of homelessness affects young people's ability to engage in school and identify better ways to support them. As far as we know, this transparency that the district is demonstrating and this partnership is really unique across the country. And we're hopeful that this work will help support students in Chicago, but also likely across the country. So the data, if you go to the next slide, shows that at any given point in time, roughly 5% of Chicago public school students are experiencing housing instability. And as Carmelo mentioned at the onset, this includes both students who are literally homeless, as well as those who are doubled up, that is living with friends or family as a result of economic need. This is equivalent to there being 1 student in every CPS classroom at a given time on average that is experiencing housing instability. And when we look at these numbers over time, the prevalence of housing instability actually increases. So over the course of their time in CPS, 13% of students will experience some form of homelessness. Another unique aspect of our partnership with CPS is that it allows us to disaggregate these patterns by student demographic characteristic. The Federal Department of Education actually doesn't require that districts report out on the race or ethnicity of students who are experiencing housing instability, which can obscure some of the inequities that Carmelo highlighted in his opening comments. As he mentioned, our country's history of segregation and unequal access to wealth accumulation has meant that Black Chicagoans are more likely to have to access the city's shelter services, and also more likely to children are more likely to experience poverty as they're growing up. Sadly, CPS is not immune to these societal patterns. We see that roughly a quarter of Black students will ever experience housing instability while they're enrolled in Chicago public schools. That's compared to about 2% of white and Asian students and 4% of Hispanic students. And as the narratives that Shantá shared really make clear, the experience of housing instability and the traumatic experiences that too often accompany them can pose barriers to students' engagement in school. So if you go to the next slide, we see that when compared to similarly stably housed peers, elementary school students who are experiencing housing instability miss on average 3 or more days of school. When we look at high school students, we see that high school students who are unaccompanied, so that is they're not living with their parent or guardian and are experiencing housing instability, actually miss 8 or more days more than their stably housed peers. And we know that in addition to these absences, we know that students experiencing housing instability also move from school to school more frequently. And these school moves are often coincide with enrollment gaps that can lead to more lost time in the classroom. And this has consequences, not surprisingly, for students' performance in school. So when we look at high school students, for example, who are literally homeless, we see that on average, their grade point averages are 0.46 points lower than stably housed, but otherwise similar high school students. That's the difference between receiving an A in one class and receiving a C. And while that may not be a huge difference when we think about the importance that grade point average plays in the post-secondary options that students have access to, I think this gap is really notable. These are average differences between students experiencing housing instability and their stably housed peers, but it's really important to note that the experiences of students vary widely. And as a result, their needs and the supports that they need are also likely to vary widely. So if you go to the next slide, we'll see that among students who are in grades 6 through 12, the plurality of students, about 40%, are identified by CPS as living doubled up for a short period of time. So that's 1 or 2 academic years. Another third of students experience what we term late teen instability. So these are students who experience their first instance of housing instability late in high school, so junior, senior year of high school. And as we can imagine, the experiences of these students, the things that precipitate their housing instability, as well as the needs that they might have, are likely to be different than other housing unstable students. When we look at the remaining third of students in grades 6 through 12 who experience housing instability, they fall into 3 main groups. The first is the group that we call district exiters. So these are young people who have their first experience of housing instability and then shortly thereafter exit the district. And these, because they're no longer enrolled in CPS, we really don't know that much about the longer term outcomes for these students or where they land. And so, one thing we're interested in is linking the data from CPS to data from the state to better understand the outcomes for these young people. Another 9.6% of students that are experiencing housing instability between grades 6 and 12 are what we call long-term doubled up. So like the short-term doubled up, they're living with family and friends as guests in their home because of economic need. But these arrangements last for much longer, 3 or more years. In the CPS data, we see these students as labeled doubled up. And then the final group of students that we see among the 6th through 12th graders who are experiencing housing instability have shorter terms of housing instability, but these are folks who are primarily residing in the city's shelter system for 1 or 2 years. It's worth noting that though we don't have time to dig into all of the details, we see very similar patterns when we look at younger students, and all of that information is in the report for folks who want to dig in more. So in addition to the varied experiences of housing instability, we also see that the interaction between students' experiences with housing stability and their academic performance varies as well. So if you go to the next slide, we see that the majority of students who experience housing instability fall into one of 2 groups. They either have below average academic performance before their first experience of housing instability that continues after they become housing unstable, or they have roughly average academic performance prior to their first experience of housing instability, that drops in that first year that they become homeless. Surprisingly, though, there's about 25% of students that experience housing instability that actually see an increase in their academic performance in the first year they're identified by the district as housing unstable. And though this seems perhaps a little counterintuitive at first, it's important to note that these students, as a result of being identified as housing unstable, may be receiving more supports from schools that can help support their academic performance. Likewise, if we think back to the narratives that Shantá shared at the beginning, often the traumatic experiences that precipitate housing instability could really hurt students' academic engagement in a variety of ways. And for some students, that could actually be lessened by moving to shelter or a shared housing unit. So all of these data, I think, really suggest a need to better understand the diverse needs of students and find ways to better support them. And so to that end, we drew on the data to identify schools where the students who are experiencing housing instability were performing above average relative to other unstably housed students in the district. And we reached out to the principals at the schools, the liaisons who work with housing unstable students, and asked them, what are they doing? How are they working with students? And what could we learn from these schools to inform broader supports for housing unstable students? And I'm going to turn it back over to Shantá to share some of the learnings from those conversations.
Thank you, Kelly. So as Kelly said, we've learned a lot in this study. What we learned is that a lot of schools are doing a lot, and they are being creative and compassionate to address the various needs of their students living in housing situations or housing unstable. An analysis of our academic identified 30 public elementary and high schools where students experiencing homelessness were achieving better than expected academic results. These are the top strategies already in place by the administrators in those schools. The first strategy is to destigmatize homelessness. No student should have to, quote, feel the tag, end quote, of homelessness or experience shame as a result of their living situation. In practice, this meant that schools must go above and beyond to fill any gaps in resources between unstably housed students and their stably housed peers. Principals also emphasized the importance of being discreet when providing these supports. Next is to know kids' stories. Principals spoke to the systematic ways for each student to develop a trusting one-on-one mentoring relationship with at least one adult in the building, whether it was a security guard, the lunch server, their favorite teacher, or the homeless liaison. Students were typically asked to choose their adult advocate, or vice versa, rather than assigning them, as it was important for there to be a genuine affinity and authentic connection at the core. Next is to closely and consistently monitor students. When discussing the importance of regular check-ins and ensuring multiple positive points of contact with an adult every day, one principal explained, quote, we are the students' everything, and we're home because we are the only thing that is consistent and reliable in their lives, end quote. Therefore, it is incumbent on the staff to know what is going on and to be responsive to the needs of these students. This consistency is what will keep students coming back when everything else in their life is in flux. Next, we have sweat the small stuff, meet children's basic needs. One school provided food to students on Saturdays if they are food insecure at home. Another school provided monthly packets of basic necessities to students, but more importantly, school personnel used this exchange time as an opportunity to get to know kids' stories and to ask them what else they needed to be successful. The school went to great lengths, including outreach to service agencies, donations, or fundraising among their alumni to get these students everything they needed. Next is to connect students and parents to opportunities to earn income. 7 of the 9 high school principals interviewed led career or vocational high schools. a disproportionately high percentage of schools compared to the 40% of high schools across the city with this distinction. These principles spoke of the positive effect of connecting to sources of income, both as a motivator to continue in school and as an opportunity for them to contribute to their family's finances. In one school, a partnership with local community colleges enables students to receive a forklift certification as early as their sophomore year that offered them the opportunity to earn $20 an hour as part of a paid job. When elementary school principals were asked to name barriers to their students' academic engagement, many spoke about connecting homeless parents with economic opportunities. Said one principal, quote, "We need partnerships with jobs and work resources for adults. No child can be a happy child while their parent is not in a good place," end quote. Next, we have make the school a lighthouse to the community. Schools are more than educational institutions. They are community institutions. They are foundational institutions in neighborhoods in which they reside. Principals emphasize that schools should be a one-stop shop for students' needs. Several schools had in-school partnerships with programs like youth engagement and mental health organizations to help students manage socio-behavioral issues and the trauma associated with homelessness. Finally, identify the right point person. Time and time again, principals highlighted the importance of identifying and appointing an engaged, sensitive staff member to act as the school's student homelessness liaison, the point person. So as you see, all of these strategies align with at least one or more of our qualitative focus group findings, and in the end, informed everything about our ecological model. Thank you. With that, I'm going to turn it back over to Carmelo.
Thank you, Dr. Robinson and Dr. Hallberg. Now we have some time for audience questions. We do not have any questions in the queue at the moment, so I will wait a moment or two to see if anyone has questions that they would like to ask of Dr. Robinson and Dr. Hallberg. If you do have questions, please do type them in the chat. All right, we do have some questions here. So one question is, were there any findings about the impact of keeping students stable in the same school and how that impacted student success?
Sorry, I'm figuring out how to rejoin. We didn't look at that explicitly, but I think it's a really good question. One thing we did look at is the extent to which there was higher mobility across schools within students who were housing unstable, and not surprisingly, we see higher rates of housing stability. But I think this is a really good question, and one that I think future research should really focus on, because one of the sort of levers within McKinney-Vento, which is the federal legislation that governs supports for students experiencing housing instability, is really thinking about like what are the ways that you can keep students in the same school, and providing transportation and other resources that allow for that. And so understanding and unpacking the impact of those, I think it would be very worth doing.
Thanks, Dr. Hallberg. We have another question or a request here. I would like to hear more about any specific strategies that schools use to destigmatize homeless status if that info is available. Dr. Robinson, I think you might be best positioned to address that question.
Thank you. Yes, principals and administrators were being very creative in how best to support students facing housing instability and destigmatize that status at the same time. One of the things that some of the principals did were to install washer and dryers in the school building. They found that a lot of students didn't want to come to school because their clothes were dirty. Well, how do you keep students coming in? How do you keep them engaged? You make sure they have clean clothes. And these washer and dryers were in a space where students could come very discreetly. And it wasn't just open to students who were homeless or housing unstable, right? That you find that students across all income brackets also need clean clothes sometimes, that's not something that's just for housing unstable students. Therefore, you destigmatize this idea that only one type of person needs clean clothes because they don't have access to them somewhere else. And what you find is that those students came to school more often. They stayed engaged. One, because they had clean clothing, but two, because they felt better about other students who they knew were housing stable, also using those resources. So that's one of the ways to do it. Another way is that when you need to reach all the students who are housing unstable at one time, then you, instead of saying, well, all students who are housing unstable, please come to the office, instead you say, we're having a special event for these students. We're having an afternoon pizza party for these students. You find ways, principals are being very creative in finding ways to connect those students, allow those students to connect with each other, because what we found in our research is that it was very important for students to build community with each other, to share resources with each other, to share camaraderie, and to give encouragement and support to each other. And that principals and teachers were finding ways to put those students together so they can build that sense of community amongst those students. Critically important. Another way to destigmatize homelessness is for people to talk about it more. For people to say, this is what's happening in our communities, that there's nothing wrong with it. And in fact, we are all so many steps away from needing assistance in some way in our lives. And so when you create a community or an atmosphere that says we can talk about these things, we start to break down those walls and those barriers, and in fact destigmatize, so that people are not ashamed to come forward and say, I'm struggling with housing instability. And if we learned anything from the 2008 recession, it was that people are closer to housing instability than we ever thought possible. And as we learned with the pandemic in this last year and the moratorium on evictions, so many families are closer to that edge than we've ever thought about before. We need to talk about it. We need to say there's no shame in that. And how can we pull together to create resources and be creative about that to support those folks when that time comes?
Thank you, Dr. Robinson. So the questions have flooded in, and I'm sort of skeptical that we'll be able to get through them all, but we'll do our best since we have a couple more minutes here. So one question, which I think, Dr. Hallberg, you can quickly answer. Do you know anything about the frequency of involvement with DCFS and housing instability?
Yes, as the questioner probably knows, we don't observe this directly, but we do have some data in CPS that shows there is a much higher engagement with DCFS and housing instability. And I think this is an area where thinking about how those two systems can interact and better support students would be very valuable.
Thanks, Dr. Hallberg. And then there's another question. Were you able to study children 6 years old and younger?
I don't know why I keep taking myself off mute. So the quantitative component of this study really focuses on K through 12 students, because those are the data that we have on their engagement with school. Some of the focus group participants, especially the parents, had younger students. We got some insights about how these challenges play out in the early years from those conversations, but the focus really is on K-12 in at least the analyses that are in their report.
Thank you. And then this will probably have to be the final question that we covered today. Did your research show schools in certain parts of the city were doing a better job than others? Did the schools with programming talk to one another?
Yeah, so this is a great question. We actually, the schools that we identified as better, as having students who are sort of outperforming the district on average were, and I think happily, sort of distributed across the city. So there's no part of the city where all of those schools are located. The district office at CPS has been doing a lot of work to bring together principals at schools, both those who are informed the study and those who didn't, to share some of these best practices. And so that's happened during like summer institutes and other conversations. And so these findings that we're sharing with you today, we also shared as a part of some of those summer institutes to help facilitate some of that conversation, which I think is really important.
All right. Well, thank you, Dr. Hallberg and Dr. Robinson, for helping to answer those questions. We will keep track of your questions, and we'll do our best to follow up individually with folks to provide answers after this event. But now I would like to transition, and I'm excited to introduce you to Michael Deuser, the Chief of the Office of College and Career Success at the Chicago Public Schools, who will share the district's perspective on the research. Chief Deuser.
Thank you so much, Carmelo, and good morning, everybody. Yes, hi, I'm Dr. Michael Deuser. I'm the Chief of College and Career Success at Chicago Public Schools. One of the offices I oversee is the Office of Student Support and Engagement, which manages our supports for students in temporary living situations. And it's in this capacity that I've had the chance to witness and to participate in this partnership that produced this study. Would like to say thank you to Dr. Hallberg and Dr. Robinson for your wonderful summary of the amazing piece of scholarship before us here. I'd also like to thank the Inclusive Economy Lab, the University of Chicago, and all of the attendees here today for the opportunity to come speak about this remarkable research. And I think moreover about this remarkable long-term relationship between research and practice to produce impact, which I think really does have few peers. In my response, I'd like to touch on three things. One is what makes this partnership unique from my perspective. A second is how this partnership has already helped us better serve and understand young people. And the third is how to make this partnership even more impactful in the future. So in terms of what makes this partnership unique, honestly, I think a lot of things make this partnership special. We have an opportunity to work with the University of Chicago, my alma mater. I'm a Harris School graduate. Humbly, I think it's one of the best universities and foremost research institutions in the world. And we get to work together in Chicago, in one of the biggest districts in the country and one of the most dynamic and robust and complex socio-educational ecosystems in the world. And through our work together, we have the chance to make a positive impact for literally hundreds of thousands of young people. And all of those things make CPS's partnership with IEL truly special. But what I would say makes it unique are relationships and trust. Everyone talks about research to practice, but in actuality, it doesn't happen very often, or at least as well as it might. This office, on the contrary, under Molly Burke's leadership, has developed a years-long partnership with the research community at U of C to ensure that there's a steady stream of communication back and forth between practitioners and researchers, and that the research community is committed to helping better answer the question of how we might achieve impact, how we all might serve all of our students better, particularly those facing the greatest obstacles to their success. In this business of education, right, research is a critical part of what we do. We often pay contract research partners to conduct evaluations to help us better understand the extent to which we're positively impacting student outcomes. Sometimes we have researchers who come with agendas of their own, or even with agendas and funding from others. And all of those can, and very much do help us learn. What makes this relationship with the Inclusive Economy Lab so special, I think, is that it's a true partnership in which the research questions, the resulting research design, and even the final report itself is a product of meaningful ongoing collaboration between CPS and the IEL and a number of other stakeholders, as they described earlier. Every single week for months, we've had meetings to share the latest in terms of findings and progress on this study and to discuss what these findings might mean in the context of how we are doing our work, which is where we really wanted to make a difference. So this isn't just a gig or a contract, nor is it even an effort to generate new knowledge for its own sake, although that's part of it and it helps. It's a partnership where both primary parties and the entire ecosystem in which both are embedded are really working together with the express purpose of developing knowledge for positive change. And to me, that's what makes it unique. And to me, that's what makes it so powerful, and why I feel so fortunate, and why I think CPS is so lucky to be able to have a partner like Inclusive Economy Labs. So no surprise then that I think this partnership has already helped us better serve young people, right? It raises that question, how has it done that? And I think it's done it in several ways. One huge area in which this partnership has helped us learn is just how large is the number of families struggling with different forms of housing instability. In particular, when some people think about homelessness, they think of people living literally without a roof over their heads. And there's no question that that is one of the most difficult forms of homelessness, and it's one in which many of our young people struggle. However, this study has helped us recognize the prevalence of doubled up families in the larger context of students and families experiencing unstable housing. Living doubled up is associated with many of the same hardships, lost opportunities, and lowered outcomes that true quote unquote homelessness is. And so it's been crucial to add this lens as we develop structures and systems and assign human beings to provide services to a broader range of students than we might previously have been attuned to. And this in turn has helped us understand just how large the problem of homelessness for CPS students really is. As I believe Dr. Hallberg shared, at any one time, 55% of CPS students experience homelessness, 13% of students experience it at some point, and 26% of our Black students experience homelessness at some point in their CPS careers, compared with 4% of Hispanic students and 2% of Asian students and 2% of white students. So this is obviously and extremely urgently one of the major equity issues of our time. And truly, that's just a piece of what we've learned. We've learned through focus groups that while housing itself is likely to be the single most important thing we can do to bring about more stable futures and better long-term outcomes for students experiencing homelessness, it's not just homelessness that constitutes barriers for these students. We've also learned that trauma comes in many forms, including sexual abuse, gun violence, mental illness, domestic violence. These are all common experiences. We've learned that in terms of family life, child welfare involvement, the death of family members, substance use in the home are common. We heard that economic barriers, including incarceration, parents who lack a high school diploma, and a lack of job opportunities continue to present rather formidable barriers to the success of our young people in temporary living situations. And these learnings have already demanded, and I think they continue to demand, shifts to make our practice more targeted, more comprehensive, and more effective. Which brings me to the third thing that I'd like to speak to, which is how to make this partnership even more impactful in the future. So, with a seminal study and a successful collaboration like this now entering the broader world, I think the bigger question for us is what next? And of course, we'll answer these questions in community with IEL, with other important stakeholders in the community who have advised on this work and in some cases provided the funding necessary for it to happen, as well as those who are going to be participating in and be, to some extent, the subjects of the research. And we're grateful to all of the stakeholders who have made this moment possible. And I'd like to humbly suggest two major areas of further inquiry and collaboration in the interest of maximizing outcomes for students experiencing homelessness. So first, I'd like to learn more about one of the most interesting and to some extent surprising findings to me that this study revealed. So if you could show whoever's on slide number 1 that I've shared, it's this one, and I believe Kelly showed this one too. But you'll see in this Profiles of Homelessness section of the report that when IEL conducted a segmentation analysis of STLS students, they actually found 3 distinct clusters of students, and they analyzed how their attendance and GPA changed after having been identified as STLS students. You'll see that in both attendance and GPA, 2 clusters either stayed relatively low, starting from a low point, or actually declined, starting from medium or a high point. But, and we can switch to the next slide as well. You'll also notice that in both attendance and GPA, in both grades K6 and in grade 612, there was a cluster of students who dramatically improved GPA and attendance after their first year of receiving services. Why is this? I don't think we know quite yet, but if we can invest additional time in research and identifying and then rigorously testing the drivers that seem to work, we could break truly new ground, I think, in serving STLS students. The McKinney-Vento Act started in 1987 with the goal of promoting stability in education, ensuring access to education, and fostering access to academic success for students in temporary living situations. And over the years, several programs and studies have shown success in bringing about greater stability and access. But to date, I was surprised and disappointed to find that no rigorous study has shown compelling evidence of being able to increase GPA for students in temporary living situations. And on a small scale, at least, I think we've done that here. And I would suggest that we have still more to learn about these segments and how they manage to turn around their attendance and their academic success. The hope, of course, and my hypothesis is that these students and families received exactly the services they needed to address the most pressing barriers they face, including but not limited to housing. If we could go to the next slide, slide 3. So it's some of these things, right? I believe that we were able to understand students, gain their trust, and connect them to services that address key other areas of vulnerability beyond homelessness, trauma, including abuse, gun violence, mental illness, domestic violence, that we were able to improve students' family life experiences to address things like the death of a family member or substance use in the home. I believe that we may have been able to address non-housing economic barriers, including incarceration, parents' lack of education, lack of job opportunities. I know we can do all of those things. More than all of this, I believe that we were able to approach these students with empathy and with acceptance of the kind that Dr. Robinson highlighted in her summary of the report's results, and that students felt valued and that it helped them engage and succeed. So I believe this is the promise of providing services and empathy in the way that we have dedicated ourselves to do. But truth be told, I don't know for sure. And I'd love for our next frontier of research or part of it to be to help us understand exactly how and how often these housing adjacent barriers were addressed and how we might be able to address them more effectively and systematically going forward. And IEL has already started to help us turn our attention in that direction. No doubt that will involve not only continuing our research partnership, but unprecedented levels of coordination among different agencies and organizations and advocacy groups in this space. That's one way I see taking our partnership to the next level. The other, I think, is continuing to work more on the ground with IEL as we engage in continuous improvement within CPS. The way this partnership works is that IEL has surfaced findings, many of which are actionable, and we, the program side, create supports and interventions to make sure that students receive the supports that research indicates they need. And in particular, we've invested a great deal in having STLS liaisons and STLS advocates, point people in the language of this study, placed throughout the district who are dedicated to identifying students in need of support, connecting them to these supports. But we don't yet have a great infrastructure for improving the training of these individuals and tracking the referrals or services that they're able to connect students to. And I think that's absolutely crucial. I'd like to know that every single one of the individuals we have in these roles is an expert, not only on this study, but on the 4 areas of vulnerability that undergird STLS students' experiences and how to really connect students reliably to supports in those areas. I'd love to have data on the number of students who need particular kinds of supports and interventions based on these identified barriers. And I'd like comprehensive data that tells us whether and how students actually received the interventions and also whether they were effective in, for instance, helping students manage mental illness or cope with substance abuse in the home, or perhaps most importantly, actually secure new housing. So we are on the way there, but I don't think we're quite there yet as a system or as an ecosystem. The IEL has already helped us start to track this kind of thing with more fine-grained information. And I certainly hope and believe that that partnership will continue, and I'm incredibly excited about it. Because I see a world in which CPS, the research community, and our partners at IEL in particular, and all agencies across the city, are of one accord, sharing a common set of data of what's happening and what's working in terms of interventions and outcomes for our most vulnerable students. And most of all, I see a world in which these barriers become less and less common and more manageable, and in which outcomes for our students once in temporary living situations are no longer predictably lower than our fully housed young people. Through this partnership and through partnership with others in our virtual room here today, thank you again all for coming. I really do believe that's possible, and I believe we're on our way. I thank each and every one of you for your interest and commitment and for your contributions to this effort and for your commitment to bringing about a world in which demography does not dictate destiny. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Chief Deuser, for sharing your perspective. We really appreciate it. Now I'm going to hand the mic over to my colleague, Emily Metz, who is the program director overseeing our housing stability work at the Inclusive Economy Lab. She will lead a panel discussion on solutions for the future. Emily?
Good morning, everyone. We are incredibly excited today to be able to bring together a diverse panel of perspectives on how Chicago can better support our CPS students and families experiencing homelessness. Our panelists today include a CPS parent, a CPS principal, and a housing service provider who works closely with CPS families in temporary living situations to help connect them to housing. Maxica Williams is a parent of 3 Chicago Public School students who were previously enrolled in the Students in Temporary Living Situations program. Maxica is currently working with the Chicago Coalition for the Homeless as a grassroots leader, a member of its Speakers Bureau, a CPS focus group member, and supporting the Bring Chicago Home campaign. She joined the Chicago Coalition for the Homeless's board of directors in 2019. Veronica Thompson is the principal of Paul Revere Elementary School. Principal Thompson has engaged in a multi-year partnership with the Office of Student Support and Engagement to enhance her school's strategies to holistically support their students and families experiencing homelessness. Finally, Laura Bass is the Director of Programs at Facing Forward to End Homelessness. Laura has helped lead several efforts to connect CPS families to safe, stable, and long-term housing. I welcome each of our panelists and ask them to turn on their cameras now. And Principal Thompson. Okay, well, hopefully Principal Thompson is able to join. She was here earlier, but I'll go ahead and kick us off. I was hoping that each panelist could speak briefly about your unique relationship with Chicago Public Schools, and in doing so, describe 1 or 2 ways that you have seen CPS proactively support students and their families experiencing homelessness, particularly within the past few years. Principal Thompson, why don't you start us off? We did briefly hear you. Are you able to connect? Okay, while we wait on Principal Thompson. Oh, can you hear us, Principal Thompson? We'll come back. Maxica, would you like to introduce yourself?
Good morning, everyone. I'm Maxica Williams. As Emily stated, I am a grassroots leader as well as CPS focus group member, Speakers Bureau for CCH, and I am a parent of 3 children at CPS, and we use STLS, Students in Transitional Living Situations program when we were homeless, when I had stage 3 breast cancer while I was in treatment. I feel that CPS allowed and gave the floor and a connection between Chicago Coalition for the Homeless, Speakers Bureau, and their CPS focus group over the past few years, and STLS liaison trainings. In these trainings, we help the STLS liaisons better help their students, parents, and families in situations. And formerly and currently CPS and CPS focus group members, we spoke on various issues, traumas of being homeless, focusing on the issues of homelessness that the children are enduring, which are mental, physical, and emotional constraints that the STLS students face. And my children face some of these as well as we were homeless. The importance for the STLS liaisons to build a connection with the families, building resources and referrals for families to receive help from the community organizations. The STLS liaisons built networks and resources with the different homeless shelters, the different food pantries, and different things like that, based off of conversations with the Chicago Coalition for the Homeless Speakers Bureaus, being there to teach, talk to them, and give them some techniques and hints on those things. And we also wanted to make sure that the STLS liaisons were discreet. They gave privacy to those students and parents in STLS, and that they were empathetic and understand the situation, and that they don't prejudge them. Some of us may have had a job before we became homeless or before we were doubled up. and we lost that job, but we might have bought our child a pair of Jordans. So don't assume because a child came in with a pair of Jordans that their parents are just faking or trying to scam the system. There are instances where parents have worked or another family member might have bought those shoes for the family. So being unbiased is something that we wanted and worked specifically in these trainings with the liaisons to develop that empathy, that compassion, and connections with the family, and don't prejudge us because we're human and our babies are going through enough already as being kids, and to already have their homes and their four corners and peace and tranquility taken from them, it's a lot on them. And to prejudge them, that's even more bias, and it hurts and hinders their education and their processes moving forward. Throughout the pandemic, CCH developed the CPS focus group. We're a group of parents, grandparents, and caregivers that wanted to make sure that our children continue to receive the education they needed in spite of the pandemic and everything that was going on. We noticed some barriers for our children they were facing educational-wise. These barriers were students living doubled up. They experienced various issues and constraints of homelessness, such as moving from place to place, not having a steady home because of the pandemic, putting fear in so many different people. And because we were so unsure and uncertain of what the pandemic really was and what was going on. No quiet place to study, embarrassment of being homeless, changing school to school, uncertainty of where they will live day to day, or uncertain of whether they will have 3 meals a day, or what the people's attitudes in these different places that they had to live doubled up with their families. And in each of these households, be it family, friends, because it wasn't just their family living there, they were living with someone else in their roof under their rules. And they didn't know if it was welcoming, harmful, or it would be chaotic there. Fear of being their peers learning of them being homeless and being laughed at. That's the most important thing. They don't want to be in a house that everybody knows that there's 100 people or 20 people walking in the background, and it's not the usual home that they had before they became homeless and started living doubled up. These children are usually forced to grow up fast and not enjoy being a child, which is a horrible thing. Every child deserves to be a child and be at peace and in comfort. Developmental issues from traumas of being shuffled from place to place due to inconsistent living situations, not wanting to go to school or take long commutes to school, bullying, fear that their peers will learn of the housing status, not having nice clothes, not having clean clothes, not having the toiletries to take a bath, wash up, and not having school supplies to do the work they need. And being exposed to different situations that children shouldn't, or perhaps their parents may not have exposed them to in their households, like drugs, violence, sexual assaults, or inappropriate things at other people's houses and dwellings. And we wanted to alleviate these barriers and close those major gaps in our children's education throughout the pandemic. And we fought and we were able to write down that the children needed tablets, computers, laptops, Wi-Fi. And for those families that are doubled up or living in homeless shelters, we wanted them to have Wi-Fi hotspots. And CPS, as well as the mayor of the city of Chicago and Chicago Coalition for the Homeless, worked hard, and other organizations in the city of Chicago to get this done and get that connection, and the kids receive the things they need. And we also recognize that some children don't know about technology or their families, and it's still not suitable for their learning needs. So we also made sure that we'll packet schoolwork for these children that they would do for a week, turn in, get it on Monday and turn it in the following Monday and get a new packet and bring it back to the school so that they didn't fall behind and slip through the cracks. But those are just things that we've noticed CPS has done. We've written letters and they listen to the letters that we write with recommendations and the different issues. So we have had a partnership with the Chicago public school system through CCH, Chicago Coalition for the Homeless. And thank you. I'll pass it back to Emma.
Thank you so much, Maxica. And there were so many, written comments in your response that I think speak to many of the strategies that Dr. Robinson spoke about in terms of helping homeless students succeed. You were really speaking to the need to destigmatize homeless status, to meeting basic needs, to telling kids stories. And I think the relationship that the coalition has built with the school district really speaks to an area in which the district has been explicitly proactively doing outreach to support their students experiencing homelessness, particularly during this pandemic. So thank you for all of that helpful context. I think for now, we'll turn it over to Laura to introduce herself, and then we can come back to Principal Thompson.
Thank you, Emily. So again, my name is Laura Bass, and I'm Director of Programs for Facing Forward to End Homelessness. And we are an organization in Chicago that provides housing and supportive services to families and individuals experiencing homelessness. And most of the families we serve have students attending Chicago public schools. So we've had the opportunity to partner with CPS in a few different ways. A few years ago, we partnered with CPS and a number of different service providers on the Families in Transition project, which allowed us to conduct assessments with families experiencing homelessness, both literal homelessness and families who are doubled up, and connect 100 families to an affordable housing with supportive services program. And it was a really exciting opportunity because, again, we recognize that many of those families that are living doubled up are as vulnerable as families in the shelter system, and experience a lot of the same challenges, but have limited opportunities for affordable, stable housing. Facing Forward was not a housing provider for that project, but we did work really closely with STLS liaisons to do outreach and assessment within Chicago public schools. And we have been looking for ways to build on that connection. And so this past year, we were able to launch a new partnership with CPS called Home Connection. So we are working with families of students experiencing homelessness to provide housing-focused case management with the goal of helping each family identify a pathway to long-term stable housing. And so we are providing some of those basic need supports that folks spoke about earlier, whether it's assistance with food, furniture, transportation, as well as wraparound supportive services geared at the needs of both the adults and children in those households. So we're providing assistance with things like housing search and application, employment assistance for adults and young people in those households, as well as wraparound supports for younger children, really from birth to young adulthood. So things like developmental screening, assistance with preschool enrollment, childcare assistance, and supports for children with special needs. And another exciting piece of that is we're also, through our funder, able to offer rental assistance. So when families do secure stable housing, we're able to remove some of those barriers of things like having assistance with a security deposit, maybe being able to pay down a past due utility bill, so families are able to actually move into their own place. And it's a new program, so we're really excited to continue to partner with CPS and with Inclusive Economy Lab to really document the impact of these supports, not just on families' housing stability, but also on the educational outcomes of children. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Laura. And one of the unique aspects of both of those programs that you mentioned is that families who are experiencing homelessness while living doubled up are actually included and able to access those supports, either for permanent supportive housing or for the housing-focused case management services, which unfortunately is not always the case. So this really has been an innovation, that in Chicago, Facing Forward and other key stakeholders in the Chicago continuum of care, as well as Chicago public schools, have really pushed for, because they see that the need, particularly among families with children enrolled in Chicago public schools, disproportionately includes families who are actually living doubled up, as opposed to experiencing what HUD refers to as literal homelessness while engaging with services in Chicago's homeless services sector. So thank you for bringing some insights into some of those ways that the district has already been trying to make that connection that Maxica was calling for the coordination with the homeless services sector and the housing supports. So building on that, for many of the attendees today who may not have prior experience working directly with students experiencing homelessness, they may actually be learning for the first time that the majority of CPS students in temporary living situations are actually living doubled up, as opposed to experiencing literal homelessness. I'm interested, from each of your unique vantage points, can you speak to some of the unique barriers and challenges that students living doubled up may face in terms of how their housing situation might impact their ability to stay engaged in school. I'd love to hear from Maxica to start us off with this question.
Yes, some of the specific issues with staying engaged when you're living doubled up, you don't have anywhere quiet to study because usually you're in a household with a lot of other individuals, and this is not your necessary household that you grew up in. So you're just getting used to these people, and they may not be the nicest or kindest. You can't get the train of thought. You don't have food to eat all the time because of other people's rules and different regulations in the household. And also the constant stigmas of those individuals you're living with, always throwing it in your parents' face or your face. Oh, when are you all gonna leave? When are you gonna move on? These stressors hurt our children educationally. They get so worn and beat down by all of the things that are going around them in the households they live in for STLS, that they can't focus and concentrate, and their mental stability and morale goes down. And they're going through so many traumas and issues because of living STLS or doubled up, that they can't concentrate on school. They lose interest in it if they live so far from the schools and they have to take 2, 3, 4 buses. That's discouraging for them as well. And like I said, the lack of transportation and their parents if they don't know about the STLS program, bus cards within the Chicago public school systems, and parents are trying to, because sometimes we're prideful, and I was one of those parents at one point. We don't always share with the school what we're going on, or what we're going through, or what's going on in our homes. And so we're trying to handle it on our own, and we don't have enough bus fare. They're missing a lot of time out of school, so they get behind and they have to repeat the school year because they've missed so many days. You're only allotted 10 days per year, calendar year, for the CPS school district. So if you miss more than that 10 days and you're not getting A's and B's, and you're not doing your tests and your homework, you get so far behind that you can't even catch up. You have to go to summer school, and and if you can't make it to summer school, you repeat that year. We also have those children that are doubled up. They just get uninspired because they're going through so much, and sometimes when parents are prideful and they don't speak up and tell the school that they need help, those children lose that interest. They're like, oh, I'm gonna be off in this worldly stuff. Or if they see continuous drug use, drug abuse, or if they've been sexually abused or anything like that, they tend to draw in. They have no one or nothing that they feel at that time to continue to encourage and push them to school. We have to have some type of case manage, or from what I've had with my children, they were fortunate to go to 2 schools, McKay Elementary, who had, they prided themselves on, it takes a village to raise a family. When I enrolled them there, when we were homeless, doubled up and living in a shelter throughout my cancer treatment, they took my babies in and they held them even closer than I did. They were there, they would talk to my kids throughout the day privately without the kids to make sure they were okay. Every other day check in. Sometimes when I couldn't come back from the doctor's appointments and chemo on time, they would sit with my babies till 4 or 5 o'clock, and they did not call DCFS because they knew I was trying, I was coming, but pace was late. They made sure my children had clothes and different things. Children living doubled up don't get that. You know, if the parents don't go to the school and sign up for it, they're already mentally drained and going through so much, and not having peers or knowing that there's other children out there going through what they're going through. They have no one to talk to. They're just stuck there on their own, and those barriers are not having a place to study, not having a consistent home, not having the transportation to get to school, and having sometimes, because parents don't know about the STLS program, changing school to school. And it's hard to go into school being a new kid all of the time. And some children living doubled up go to 6 or 7 schools a year, and that's not right. They should have a stable school to be at so that they can find that community where it takes a village like my children were able to find. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that perspective, Maxica. I think that Principal Thompson, I would be really curious to hear your vantage point as the school leader. You know, Maxica was speaking to the real importance of building trust with families so that they feel comfortable coming forward and telling their stories. I'm curious to hear about your perspective from the school side of working with families living doubled up. if you are able to unmute. Yeah, unfortunately, it seems like we are not connected to Principal Thompson. I'll go, Laura, as the housing provider who's helping to bridge this gap for families. What has it been like for you to work with families living doubled up, particularly given that Facing Forward is a part of the continuum of care and traditionally works with families experiencing literal homelessness?
Thank you. I think one of the things that we've learned is that, we know that families who are experiencing, a doubled up living situation are not prioritized for homeless specific housing assistance through a continuum of care. So that is one barrier, but that it's also really hard for families to find services and information that they need to resolve their housing crisis. So often the experience that families have is that they might be reaching out to a lot of different agencies and feel as though they're really kind of getting the runaround, or that they're having to do a lot of work on their own. And the unfortunate reality is that our homeless service system, as well as the world of kind of mainstream affordable housing, is really confusing and can feel really fragmented. And so I think it's great to have the opportunity to really be able to provide that individualized one-on-one assistance to each family to help them figure out what resources might be a good fit for them. Instead of just saying, you can call this number to apply for rental assistance, or you can try this website to put yourself on a wait list, to really be able to kind of walk that path with a family and help identify what are the barriers and what strengths they bring to that process. So I think that's, one of the things we would love to see is just greater coordination. And that's something I think our system has been working on, is how do we really create a situation where families don't feel like they're getting the runaround, and we're actually able to connect them to the assistance that they most need.
Yes, thank you for that, Laura. I think we are getting close to, concluding the time to conclude the panels, but I did want to make sure to ask one more question that I think is really underpinning a lot of the discussion across the various presentations and remarks today, which is, as Dr. Robinson's presentation underscored, for many students and families experiencing homelessness, a lack of access to stable housing is only one of many overlapping and complex factors outside of school that may be affecting the child's ability to attend and fully engage in their education. I'm curious, given this reality, what role each of you think we can play, those of us who are outside of the school district, in helping holistically support these students and their families? What do you see as the biggest current gaps in available services, and what opportunities do the rest of us have to step up and support? And I will ask Maxica if you would like to start us off.
Yes, for that question, I think as a city and anyone looking from the outside of the school system, outside of being a parent or staff or someone who works directly with the direct services of the CPS, we need to better address the barriers that students experience with homelessness and their families face when they're trying to keep their children engaged in school. By speaking to our aldermen and alderwomen, state representatives, the mayor, about doing something about the homelessness in the city of Chicago and allotting more money and funding into the budget, especially with now, because of the pandemic, there is so much funding out there, to actually broaden and make up more programs like the one Laura speaks of that she works with the CPS schools. Because those are the people who are in power. They have the power to change those budgets and a lot more money, because there's about 55,000 people homeless in the city of Chicago. And there's so many different forms of homelessness, as you all stated, that HUD's definition of homeless, and they usually do the housing piece. If you don't fall under their definition of homeless, you generally don't get housed. There's very few circumstances where you do, and doubled up is one of those forms of homelessness that are not recognized by HUD. And I also want to let you all know that having these conversations with those individuals that are in power is important. Because we voted them in office as their constituents. And also partner with Bring Chicago Home and Chicago Coalition for the Homeless. We have that new program called Bring Chicago Home. It's we're asking for the real estate transfer tax that's currently already in effect on homes sold over $1 million to be taxed at a different higher rate. And this money would generate a populated amount of money in a designated revenue stream specifically for homelessness, because we have a pandemic and an epidemic of homelessness in the city of Chicago. And we're asking everybody to support Bring Chicago Home and go on to Bring Chicago Home website, as well as the Chicago Coalition for the Homeless website, and support these different things. Have these conversations in your communities with everybody you know. It's going to be a resolution, a question we're trying to get on the ballot next voting season, so that the constituents here in the city of Chicago can vote on it and get this real estate transfer tax passed and set into law. And this money can be generated for so many different, all the many faces of homelessness, so that we can all be housed, because everybody deserves housing. Housing is a human right. No child, no parent, nobody can heal from the traumas of being homeless without the housing and the supportive services that Laura spoke of, which are wraparound services to welcome a person into their community, new community, since they were homeless. And that's pretty much what I have to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Maxica. And that's such a nice transition over to Laura. Maxica really underscored the need to address the housing. I know that Facing Forward, when working with clients, are really thinking about the holistic set of supportive services that can help address the underlying traumas that the family members have been facing. So I'm curious to hear your perspective on, particularly, the coordination piece, and making sure that we're holistically addressing, the needs of families.
Thank you. Yeah, so definitely we need to continue to work on coordinating services between our housing providers, our homeless service system, Chicago Public Schools, and the other wealth of service providers that have resources available for those students. We also need to think about, I think there was a question earlier about the early childhood piece. So understanding that the experiences of children, as infants, also really impacts their ability to learn. And that's a group that can be easy to miss because they're not yet engaged with the school system. So also making sure that we're able to connect, families with very young children and pregnant people to housing resources. The big piece, as Maxica said, is we do need more affordable housing, and we need to be creative about identifying revenue to increase affordable housing. And then we also have to help families navigate the housing realities that we currently have. It can be really hard if a family is not willing or able to access shelter, to make sure that they really have somebody who is able to support them through that process. And we do have programs that we know are effective and do end homelessness for families and children. So we really need to look for opportunities to scale those up. And I think the supportive service piece, as Maxica said, is also really critical. So while housing is the big thing that really makes a difference for families, to really look at opportunities to coordinate case management supports, mental health supports, all those education supports for families who need that extra hand holding. So to what extent can we take these can we provide in-home supports or in-school supports and remove barriers for families to access those services?
Thanks, Laura. And Principal Thompson, let's see if maybe with one more shot, as the school leader, it does sound like we have you back. How can the rest of us help? What can we do to support the school system and you and your efforts to serve your families effectively?
First of all, my sincerest apologies. I'm so sorry for these difficulties. I wanted to start with, can you hear me? Okay, are we okay now?
It is, I think,
can you hear me?
But still coming in and out a little bit.
Okay, I'll do my best. I want to acknowledge Chief Deuser, first of all, for the vision CPS has put forth on the issue of homelessness. That is so critical, to have a district behind work. We started as a district, when I started more than 25 years ago, it was always about the legal aspect of homelessness, making sure we were paying attention to policy. Now we've moved to holistic, and as a school leader, that is so important to me. Everything, and Maxica, I appreciate you so much for your leadership as a parent. As a parent, that is so critical, and we need more of that. But everything that she has expressed, I can echo. I have seen all of these scenarios play out in my school. And it was only until the last 3 years when we became part of Beating the Odds, we started to look at the barriers, not judging, not saying it's the gym shoes that are more important than the education, because that is absolutely not the case. So as a school leader, I appreciate the comprehensive supports so that we can move from short-term solutions to long-term solutions. So as Chief Deuser talked about, where's the data that show that we are making an impact? I can give you examples. Just recently this year, I had a homeless family, which was very high profile. But because we are such a close community, whatever was in the media about this, we wrapped around the family and made sure that her daughter graduated with dignity. So that's what we're doing at the school level as a result of this work. Her daughter graduated with dignity. We carried her all the way to the end. And I know that many other schools are doing the same. So for us, we just need a number. We need a number. Who do we call? I'm fortunate that I have a full-time social worker and counselor. That's another structural piece because the principal can't do it all. So I have the most wonderful counselor and social worker that work with me that have an equity mindset, that believe that we're supposed to help all of our families, and they do it. But it takes time because all these resources are not sitting on our desk. So we have to look for them. And it brings me back to a story many, many years ago where I had a family that suddenly became homeless. And my AP and I had to set them up in a hotel. But not only did we have to put them in that hotel, we had to give them food. And I remember taking them to Boston Market, and that being Boston Market being a new experience for them. So what we're doing matters, and it goes deeper than what's legally required. We have to be holistic about this work. And I have so much more to say, but that's it for me. I just really appreciate the opportunity. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Principal Thompson. I'm so glad that we were able to hear in that concluding question some of your remarks about this research. And I think so much of what you just said is very in alignment, as you noted, with Chief Deuser's vision, and really thinking about, how is it that we can both identify, the whole set of additional complicating factors that students and families might be facing, and how do we ensure that the services are ready and available for our school leaders and our educators to connect families with those services to help address those needs. So with that, I will turn it back over to Carmelo.
Thank you all so much, and especially to Laura, Maxica, and Principal Thompson for sharing your perspectives. I'm so glad that we were able to hear from you there, Principal Thompson. As our report in today's discussion made clear, student homelessness is a much more widespread phenomenon in Chicago than previously understood. It is also a struggle that disproportionately impacts the city's Black community. These inequities are the result of both past and present intentional and unintentional discrimination in hiring, finance, and public policy. Every student who experiences homelessness in Chicago has their own story, their own hopes and ambitions, and their own unique struggles. Educators in Chicago, like Principal Thompson, are doing their best to support these students, and there are opportunities for them to learn one another. Our vision for the future is one in which student homelessness is a rare and short-lived event. Achieving this future will only be possible if, as a society, we expand access to safe, stable, and affordable housing and ensure that access is equitable. The federal, state, and local governments will all have a role to play in achieving this vision. In the short term, there's more that we can do to support students who are experiencing homelessness. And the discussion section of our report highlights several opportunities to better support students who are housing unstable. First, housing-focused case management, like that offered by Facing Forward, is designed to support families with their individual needs, as well as to hasten the transition to stable housing. The Inclusive Economy Lab is supporting Facing Forward and preparing for an evaluation of this promising model. And expanding housing supports available through this model to include short-term rental assistance could be helpful. Because many students experience homelessness for 1 to 2 years while living doubled up, it's also possible that unrestricted cash assistance could accelerate the transition to safe, stable housing by helping families to address unpaid medical debt or help with a security deposit or other barriers to housing. Identifying students at risk of homelessness and providing academic supports as well as connection to housing resources could help both reduce homelessness and blunt its impact on student academic achievement. Finally, students who experience homelessness are less likely to graduate from high school and may benefit from supports in the transition to post-secondary education, like those offered by 1 Million Degrees. So if you're interested in engaging further with these issues, if you would advance to the next slide, we will be sending out a link after this email to gauge interest from participants in today's discussion. You'll be offered opportunities to sign up for future discussions focused on enhancing targeted school-based supports, opportunities to resolve the housing instability and policies and programs that can be effective at doing so, or opportunities to partner on upstream prevention and cross-system collaboration. We are now at time, so I'd like to leave you all with this quote from a principal that we heard in the course of our research. And I think Principal Thompson's comments at the end of the panel are just such a compelling example of this commitment on the part of Chicago's educators. I want my homeless kids to feel known, valued, and inspired, just like all kids. I hope that you'll take time to read through our report and to continue to work with us to solve these issues facing Chicago's youth. Thank you so much for your time.